Good afternoon, and welcome to this series of monthly online lectures discussing Joseph Ratzinger's landmark work, The Spirit of the Liturgy, hosted by the Society for Catholic Liturgy. My name is Father David Friel, and I serve as Vice President for the Society for Catholic Liturgy, as well as the moderator for today's session. Just to begin with a couple housekeeping notes. First, as always, this session is being recorded. Secondly, as has been our practice throughout this lecture series, we'll not have a question and answer session during the presentation today on account of the number of registrants. We do hope, however, to be able to continue the conversation with you at our 2025 annual conference to be held at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. this September. Note that registration is now open and the call for papers is available on our website. The title for this conference is The Spirit of the Liturgy, the Liturgical Legacy of Joseph Ratzinger-Benedict XVI. More information and all the registration details are available on the Society's website, liturgysociety.org. Note also that our next online lecture will be offered on the 1st of May at 4 p.m. Eastern. The topic will be Sacred Time, and our presenter will be Reverend Michael Earthman, a member of our board and the pastor of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish in Houston, Texas. If you missed any of our previous lectures in this series, they are now available on our YouTube channel, which can be found at youtube.com/liturgy society. Today's presentation deals with the section of Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy devoted to the Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. And it's given by the Reverend James Bradley, who serves as president of our society. Father Bradley is a priest of the Personal Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham and assistant professor of canon law at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He read music, theology, and canon law at the universities of Bristol, Oxford, and London, respectively, and holds a doctorate in canon law from the Catholic University of America. His research focuses on the Church's liturgical law and sacramental discipline, and to this end, he is completing a doctorate in liturgical studies and sacramental theology at the University of Vienna, Austria, where he's part of the international research project, Anglican Traditions in the Catholic Church. He's published in a number of canonical and liturgical journals, including The Jurist, Studia Canonica, Forum Canonicum, Antiphon, and Ecclesia Orans. It's my pleasure now to welcome Father James Bradley to address us on the topic of the Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Father Friel for his introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to be with us during this lecture series. Our review of the Spirit of the Liturgy moves in this lecture from a consideration of the altar and the direction of liturgical prayer to the issue of the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. At the outset, we should recall that part 2 of the Spirit of the Liturgy is given over entirely to the topic time and space in the liturgy. Ratzinger therefore situates his specific consideration of the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament within this broader context, relating his thoughts on this matter to other, more general reflections on ecclesiastical architecture, including on the nature, place, use, and purpose of the altar, topics conveniently examined in our last 2 sessions. The implication that these 3 things, sacred space, the altar, and the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament, are to some high degree to be considered in a unitary way, is also emphasized by the relative brevity of this chapter. There is, no doubt, much more that could be said about the presence of Christ in the Most Holy Eucharist than we find in these short pages. Indeed, there is more that could be said even about the history, means, and purpose of Eucharistic reservation. And so what's implied by the context and concision of this chapter within the overall work is that for Ratzinger, any consideration of the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament must be framed by more general liturgical theological principles that are already set out in the book and through which we have been ably guided in these talks over the past several months. Next, and arising from this connection with both sacred space in general and the altar in particular, in discussing the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament, our author asks us to consider something eminently tangible. Certainly, the topic of Eucharistic reservation arises from and redounds to profoundly theological truths, and the outworking of these truths is a broad concern for Ratzinger throughout his liturgical writings. But we should also be aware that we are basically dealing here with practical considerations. This is made abundantly clear by the final sentence of the chapter, toward which Ratzinger's entire preceding discussion is directed. If the presence of the Lord is to touch us in a concrete way, he says, the tabernacle must also find its proper place in the architecture of our buildings. This applied perspective is characteristic of Ratzinger's entire theology of the liturgy, and especially given the broad scope of this book. For Ratzinger, what the Church professes must be realized, and realized well, that in turn it may be believed. With this context and fundamental orientation in mind, the modest aims of this afternoon's presentation are twofold. First, to consider the main points of Ratzinger's exposition on the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament, and secondly, to see whether, how, and to what extent these essentially practical considerations conform to the current discipline of the Church on this matter. First, then, we come to reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in the history of the Church. Ratzinger begins with a broad statement on the historical practice of the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in the West, noting that reservation in a tabernacle in the church building was essentially unknown in the first millennium, when the principal focus was instead the altar afforded due honor by a ciborium, lamps, and curtains. This is not to say that the early church knew nothing of Eucharistic reservation. The apostolic constitutions attest to Eucharistic reservation in the homes of the faithful, and in a room adjacent to the church called variously a pastoforio, secretarium, or sacrarium. In this case, the Blessed Sacrament was kept in a cabinet or conditorium, an example of which may be seen in the mosaics of the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia on the screen. Ratzinger's main point, then, is that it was only from the 9th century that the regular reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in churches proper and for liturgical devotional purposes became a norm. As he observes, this was, quote, the fruit of passionate theological struggles and their resulting clarifications, in which the permanent presence of Christ in the consecrated host emerged with greater clarity, unquote. In England and France, the practice was usually to reserve the Blessed Sacrament in a hanging pyx, often in the shape of a dove above the altar, whilst in German lands a noble sacrament house was placed near, but nevertheless somewhat apart from the altar, often on the gospel side of the presbytery. The absence of the tabernacle in whatever form from the altars of the first millennium has caused some to question the authenticity of the practice of Eucharistic reservation at all, and even to challenge its ongoing place and relevance in the life of the Church today, particularly as regards Eucharistic devotion and adoration, rather than simply as a means of providing for the communion of the sick. This view is evident amongst proponents of what Ratzinger calls the decadence theory of liturgical development. This is the idea that the worship of the early centuries of the Church is not simply a foundation for what followed, but something of a limit for what should be considered authentic and therefore imitated today. Supporters of this decadence theory in particular single out the Middle Ages as a time of liturgical decline and even corruption. The decadence theory is not exactly new. It emerged from Protestant critiques of the 16th century, for example in Thomas Cranmer's preface to the Book of Common Prayer and in the 1562 Articles of Religion. Quote, "The sacraments were not ordained of Christ to be gazed upon or to be carried about, but that we should duly use them." End quote. The idea reared its head once more during the 20th century, when, in contrast to more authentic concerns of the liturgical movement, this was criticized by Pius XII in his great encyclical letter on the liturgy, Mediator Dei. "The liturgy of the early ages," he wrote, "is most certainly worthy of all veneration, but ancient usage must not be esteemed more suitable and proper on the simple ground that it carries the savour and aroma of antiquity." He continued, "More recent liturgical rites likewise deserve reverence and respect. They too owe their inspiration to the Holy Spirit, who assists the Church in every age, even to the consummation of the world." What Pope Pius XII remarked about liturgical rites as such can be extended, mutatis mutandis, also to liturgical praxis, to the extent this conforms to more fundamental principles and has received appropriate and sufficient ecclesiastical approbation. Ratzinger elsewhere refutes more fully this attempt to identify and return to a basic form of the liturgy, and both Manfred Hauke and our own Father Michael Lang have explained the dire consequences of such an approach. The crux of Ratzinger's riposte to the decadence theory is that the Last Supper provided the dogmatic content of the sacrament of the Most Holy Eucharist, not its ritual form. And so, in keeping with what is proposed by Pius XII in Mediator Dei, legitimate liturgical expression in every age can and does constitute an authentic and organic development that is rightly to be considered part of the deposit of faith. For Ratzinger, then, the fact that the tabernacle as we know it was unknown in the first 1,000 years of the Church's life is certainly an historical reality, but it is not a decisive hermeneutical key in establishing correct liturgical practice today. Rather, the fact that this legitimate development developed legitimately is precisely a sign of the living voice of the Church and the value of sacred tradition in every age. Of the various theological struggles and clarifications that led to an uptick in the promotion of the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament for these liturgical devotional rather than more strictly practical purposes, we can include the influential treatise of the 9th century monk Ratzinger, entitled De Corpore et Sanguine Domini. This text, which broadly opposed the doctrine of transubstantiation, was subsequently adopted by Berenger of Tours in his Eucharistic disputes with Lanfranc, before Berenger was himself condemned by the Council of Vercelli in 1050. That council's judgment in turn gave rise to the Eucharistic Credo of Gregory VII, issued in 1078, and famously reasserted by Paul VI in his 1965 encyclical letter, Mysterium Fidei. Ratzinger and Berenger's arguments were also taken up by Protestant theologians in the debates of the 16th century, notably Nicholas Ridley, Pietro Vermigli, and Martin Bucer. Whilst the Council of Trent vigorously reaffirmed the Church's doctrine on the Eucharist, it was more practical reforms emerging from the Council that led to this belief being more clearly emphasized in liturgical praxis. This is perhaps most evident in the legislation on ecclesiastical appointments issued by Carlo Borromeo in 1577, and in the earlier influential 1542 Constitutiones of Gian Matteo Ghiberti, as well as the decrees of the Legatine Synod convened by Cardinal Reginald Pole in London in 1555. These instances of local legislation provided clearer and more confident examples of discipline concerning the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament, especially in respect of the tabernacle, its design, its position, its adornment, and its use. To summarize, then, whilst setting out the broad historical development of Eucharistic reservation from the first millennium to the second, Ratzinger is emphatic that this does not represent a distortion, but a legitimate development, rooted in the Church's consistent belief in the Eucharist from the earliest centuries of her existence. He demonstrates this, in turn, by reaffirming that faith in the presence of Christ in the Most Holy Eucharist may be identified in the Scriptures, notably, of course, in John 6 and in the Pauline epistles, and also in the writings of the Fathers, especially Justin Martyr, Ignatius of Antioch, and Augustine, all of which collectively show how the earliest centuries of the Church had, quote, no doubt about the great mystery of the presence bestowed upon us, about the change of the gifts in the Eucharistic prayer, end quote. Secondly, the unity of the Eucharistic mystery, celebrated, worshipped, and received. Drawing still more on patristic sources, and particularly vocabulary regarding the Eucharist, Ratzinger next discusses the contribution of Henri de Lubac's 1944 work, Corpus Mysticum. According to de Lubac, and Ratzinger in turn, the terms corpus verum and corpus mysticum were, until the Middle Ages, understood to be one and the same thing. Corpus mysticum did not mean the mystical body, in the sense of a merely pneumatological reality absent any outward realization, but was instead pertaining to the mystery, the sphere of the sacrament. This means that to speak of the corpus mysticum is to speak of but one side of a single coin, the sacramental presence of Jesus Christ, both visible and invisible, together in the one mystery of the Most Holy Eucharist. This properly sacramental notion of the Eucharist, i.e., an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, has repercussions for liturgical forms of various kinds, be they texts, or gestures, or symbols, including the furniture and arrangement of places for worship, such as the placement and location of the tabernacle. Secondly, this has broader ecclesiological consequences, summarized in de Lubac's famous formulation, "The Eucharist makes the Church." De Lubac demonstrates that over the course of history, a slow inversion took place between the meanings of the expressions the mystical body and the true body. And as Ratzinger himself affirms, in the patristic era, the phrase corpus mysticum was itself used not simply in a way that went beyond the pneumatological, but explicitly, quote, to express the sacramental body, the corporeal presence of Christ in the sacrament, end quote. For this reason, then, Ratzinger insists that, quote, the Blessed Sacrament contains a dynamism, end quote, the consequence of which is that the Most Holy Eucharist, in fieri and in facto esse, is one and the same Eucharistic mystery to be celebrated, to be worshipped, and to be received. This is why, from that same historical perspective which we've already discussed, the early Church was at ease with the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament for the communion of the sick, because this was understood to be an act at one with the Eucharistic celebration. In a similar way, Eucharistic reservation for liturgical devotional reasons is a legitimate and worthy practice countenanced by the Church over many centuries, precisely because it, in turn, redounds to the unity of the Eucharistic mystery. Ratzinger's concern for this notion of the unity of the Eucharistic mystery is also a contribution to the question of the reification of the Most Holy Eucharist. By this is meant the Eucharist taken as a thing, which is an activity, a result of, or something somewhat apart from, the heart of the life of the Church. This view is often accompanied by a certain anthropocentric tendency, in which the liturgy is viewed not firstly as the Opus Dei and as an Actio Ecclesiae, but as a human endeavor open to a certain subjectivity or arbitrariness. This can also lead to a rather problematic absolute distinction between the liturgical celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice and the worship of the Eucharistic mystery outside Mass. As Ratzinger explains, in the fervour of the early liturgical movement, some argued for precisely such a distinction. The desire to return to the sources of the liturgy presented what were perceived as contrasting patristic and medieval views of the Eucharistic mystery, which in hermeneutical terms alleged a rupture in the Church's liturgical sacramental belief and praxis. The result of this was, as Ratzinger summarizes, that the Eucharistic presence was, quote, understood not as the presence of a person, but as the presence of a gift distinct from the person, end quote. Ratzinger, after the manner of Odo Cazol's mystery theology, explains that this is a false dichotomy. His caution against such a reification of the Eucharist has important practical consequences to which we must return. Ratzinger reacts to this view in this way, quote, how is the body of Christ supposed to become a thing? The only presence is the presence of the whole Christ. Receiving the Eucharist does not mean eating a thing-like gift, body and blood. No, there is a person-to-person exchange, a coming of the one into the other. The living Lord gives himself to me, enters into me, and invites me to surrender myself to him, so that the apostles' words come true. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And only thus is the reception of Holy Communion an act that elevates and transforms a man. End quote. This leads to Ratzinger's final point, not just about the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in general, but reservation for the purpose of adoration in particular. This, in a sense, is the development that Ratzinger seeks to justify above all in this chapter. For Ratzinger, quote, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it merely added to it, end quote. On the contrary, quote, communion only reaches its true depths when it is supported and surrounded by adoration, end quote. This is where the historical and theological foundations that we've reviewed so far find their most practical application, setting us up nicely for a consideration of the liturgical norms to follow. For Ratzinger, it is impossible to propose a true division of the Eucharistic mystery. As he puts it, quote, the Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment, end quote. This emphasis of Ratzinger's on the personal encounter with Jesus Christ in the one Eucharistic mystery informs the quality of the adoration proper to all liturgical worship of that mystery, whether it be in the celebration of the Mass or in other legitimate forms of Eucharistic worship. Speaking to the crowds at World Youth Day in Cologne in 2005 as Pope, our author made this point explicitly. In the Eucharist, he said, adoration must become union. So the intimacy both of Holy Communion and of Eucharistic worship outside the Mass are oriented toward this one single goal. It is for this reason, then, that the abiding presence of Christ in the tabernacles of our churches acts not simply as a focus for corporate and individual devotion, but as the constant summons of the Church to her faithful, and indeed to the world, of precisely the need to pursue that union with God, which is the hope of every human heart. As Ratzinger puts it, quote, this presence has the effect of keeping the Eucharist forever in church. The church never becomes a lifeless space, but is always filled with the presence of the Lord, which comes out of the celebration, leads us into it, and always makes us participants in the cosmic Eucharist. A church without the Eucharistic presence is somehow dead, even when it invites people to pray. But a church in which the eternal light is burning before the tabernacle is always alive, is always something more than a building made of stones. Thirdly, then, reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in the liturgical norms. With all of this before us, we can now turn to a brief consideration of the current liturgical norms governing the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in light of what Ratzinger proposes. In doing so, it's our intention only to highlight specific points of confluence between Ratzinger's work and the discipline of the Church today. In particular, we'll consider how the current norms emphasize the two central points of this chapter. First, the essential place of Eucharistic reservation in the life of the Church, and secondly, the unity of the Eucharistic mystery. The general law on the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in the Latin Church is principally to be found in Chapter 2 of Book 4 of the Code of Canon Law, specifically Canons 934 to 940. Other relevant legislation is given in the General Instruction of the Roman Missal, Numbers 314 to 317, and in the Roman Ritual, in both Holy Communion and worship of the Eucharistic mystery outside Mass, and in the Book of Blessings, especially in the rite for the blessing of a new tabernacle at Numbers 919 to 929. Canon 934 begins by establishing the categories of sacred places where the Blessed Sacrament either must or may be reserved. Sacred places are designated by dedication or blessing for the purpose of divine worship or for the burial of the faithful. Of the sacred places designated for divine worship, there are essentially three kinds: churches, oratories, and chapels. All are designated for divine worship in that general sense, but the specific liturgical rites that may be celebrated in them, and the right of access of the faithful to them, distinguish them from one another. For a church, in which all acts of divine worship may be celebrated, the Christian faithful have a right of access. For an oratory, in which most acts of divine worship may be celebrated, the community or the group of the faithful for which it is erected have a right of access, and others may be invited to come to this place. For a chapel, in which rites may only be celebrated with the permission of the competent ecclesiastical authority, only the physical persons for which the chapel is provided have access. Others have no such right. The law on the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament broadly follows the pattern established for sacred places. The more public the place, the greater the expectation of the legislator that the Blessed Sacrament be reserved there. To this end, the law requires the Blessed Sacrament to be reserved in a cathedral church or its equivalent, in every parish church, and in a church or oratory connected to the house of a religious institute or a society of apostolic life. These are either public places of worship, or places so intimately connected with a certain kind of community, that is, religious or a society of apostolic life, that the permanent presence of Christ in the Most Holy Eucharist is presented by the law as a sine qua non of the place's purpose within ecclesial life. Here it can be useful also to consider the connection between public and ecclesial in the liturgical norms. The Code describes the liturgy as, quote, the whole public worship of God, and states that this is carried out, quote, in the name of the Church, by persons legitimately designated, and through acts approved by the authority of the Church, end quote. So the extent to which a given place is intended to be a setting for actually public acts of worship corresponds to the weight given in the norms to the expectation that the Blessed Sacrament will be reserved there. This allows us to understand, as Ratzinger sets out, the fundamentally ecclesial nature of the Eucharistic mystery. The more a sacred place is where the life of the Church is to be found, the more important it is that the Most Holy Eucharist is permanently and perpetually to be reserved there. For this reason, Canon 937 requires that a church in which there is Eucharistic reservation is, quote, to be open to the faithful for at least some hours every day, so that they can pray before the Most Blessed Sacrament. The norms also express the unity of the Eucharistic mystery that is so present in Ratzinger's exposition. Whilst the code itself regulates the fundamental discipline regarding the place for the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament, for instance, requiring that the Blessed Sacrament ordinarily be reserved in only one tabernacle in a sacred edifice, the liturgical books point to this more broadly theological point. The Roman ritual notes that, from an historical perspective, Eucharistic reservation for the purpose of viaticum, quote, led to the praiseworthy custom of the adoration of this heavenly banquet, which is kept in places of worship, end quote. It also observes that, from a theological and pastoral point of view, the tabernacle, quote, reminds us of both the presence of the Lord, which derives from the sacrifice of the Mass, and of our brethren whom we must embrace with Christian charity, end quote. At the same time, the norms governing the placement of the tabernacle, quote, on the altar where the Mass is being celebrated, end quote, invert the traditional practice of the Roman Rite, proposing that the unity of the Eucharistic mystery is in fact more clearly to be seen when the tabernacle and the altar are distinct, quote, since the Eucharistic presence of Christ is the fruit of the consecration and should appear as such, end quote. Here we can recall Ratzinger's insistence that, quote, the Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment, end quote. If this is so, this volte-face in the Church's liturgical discipline may unintentionally risk inviting precisely the disunity and rarefied view of the Most Holy Eucharist which the norms intend to avoid. Arrangements that therefore seek to harmonize the tabernacle with the altar, even if not combining them in a single structure, are surely to be preferred. Indeed, for this reason, in his apostolic exhortation Sacramentum Caritatis, number 69, Benedict XVI noted that, quote, in churches which do not have a Blessed Sacrament chapel, and where the high altar with its tabernacle is still in place, it is appropriate to continue to use this structure for the reservation and adoration of the Eucharist, taking care not to place the celebrant's chair in front of it, end quote. Some concluding remarks. Criticisms of Ratzinger's work in the spirit of the liturgy often challenge his conclusions by questioning his abilities as a liturgical historian and by pointing to a perceived over-reliance on certain authors and certain works, such as Louis Bouillet's Liturgy and Architecture. Yet no reasonable person can surely doubt that Ratzinger's approach, taken overall, conforms to precisely the kind of liturgical catechesis implicit in the Council's call for a full, conscious and active participation, a call recently given renewed emphasis in Pope Francis's apostolic letter, Desideria Desideravi. In fact, Ratzinger presents an eminently synthetic view of the liturgy, drawing on scriptural, historical, dogmatic, and disciplinary elements. That he does not go into great detail is hardly the point. Rather, by identifying central concerns, he proposes, but does not insist upon, solutions to liturgical questions that are already present in the Church's tradition. There's a tendency to the anthropocentric? Let's revisit Ad Orientem. There's a risk of banality in sacred music? Let's return to a true connection between word and song. There's a risk of creating a division between Eucharistic celebration and Eucharistic adoration. Let's renew our understanding of how the Church developed these practices. In affirming the legitimate development and ongoing justifiable place of Eucharistic reservation in the life of the Church today, and in his assertion of the unity of the Eucharistic mystery, Ratzinger again points to practical solutions in the face of distortions of the Church's doctrine and practice, through such relatively simple things as the placement of the tabernacle and the need for appropriate catechesis. But the foundation of these points, which he is also keen to underline, is yet more vital: an understanding of the centrality not just of the Most Holy Eucharist, but of the person of Jesus Christ in the life of the Church, and the immutable need to reaffirm this truth by a consistent and faithful adherence to authentic tradition. Itself a sign that in Jesus Christ, as Benedict XVI put it, quote, "The distance of the centuries is overcome, and the risen one offers himself alive and active for our sake in the Church and in the world today." Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Board of Directors and the entire Society for Catholic Liturgy, I'd like to thank Father Bradley for his excellent lecture today. As a reminder, this lecture series continues next month with a presentation by Father Michael Earthman on the topic of sacred time. These monthly lectures are leading us up to our annual conference centered on the liturgical legacy of Joseph Ratzinger-Benedict XVI this September. Registration is now open, so please visit the website for the Society, liturgysociety.org, for further information on how to register for the conference and also how to become a member of the Society. Note that the deadline for our call for papers has been extended through Easter Tuesday, April 22nd. So please consider submitting a proposal to give a paper at our conference as well. Finally, we hope to see you again next month at 4 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, May 1st, when we'll have the pleasure of hearing Father Earthman's presentation on sacred time. Many thanks for your participation today, and I hope very much that each of you will have, over these next few weeks, a fruitful celebration of the central mysteries of our faith. God bless you all.